All right, so you want to dive deep into humanitarian work, particularly with Médecins Sans Frontières, MSF. We're right there with you. Get ready for some fascinating insights because we're taking a look at this academic paper analyzing the motivations of aid workers. And let me tell you, it's not always what you'd expect. Like, we often think of aid work as this purely selfless thing, right?
Right.
But it turns out it's way more complex than that.
Yeah, this research really digs into all the different factors at play, especially in a high-pressure environment like MSF.
Yeah, and speaking of MSF, one of the things that jumped out at me from this paper was how much joining MSF, particularly early in your career, can be like a huge career boost. Like one worker even described it as having MSF on their resume as like having a ton of weight. Not the kind you're lugging around after weeks in the field, but the kind that like opens doors in the world of international aid.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, though, when you think about MSF's reputation, right?
Yeah.
It's not just some small charity. It's a massive, globally respected institution.
Yeah.
And with that comes structure, specialization,
Right.
and yeah, even internal politics, just like any large organization.
Totally. And this paper really highlights how MSF kind of throws young workers into the deep end in a way that you just don't really see in a lot of other fields. Like imagine being 23 fresh out of uni and suddenly you're coordinating logistics for hundreds of people dealing with these incredibly complex medical situations like in the Congo.
Oh, yeah. Talk about a trial by fire. I mean, the stakes are obviously incredibly high. But the paper argues that this level of responsibility so early on can be like incredibly formative.
Yeah, it's like a crash course in real world experience.
Exactly.
But it's not all high pressure situations and rapid career progression. The paper also gets into some of the disparities that exist within MSF. Like, for instance, it talks about how workers from the global south often have very different experiences and pay scales compared to their counterparts from wealthier nations.
Right. That's an important point. The research acknowledges that for some, especially those coming from resource constrained settings, MSF salaries are actually quite good compared to local options, while others might be drawn to the non-monetary rewards, prioritizing the experience and the impact over the financial aspect.
Yeah, it's a good reminder that there's no one MSF experience. It's incredibly diverse and it's influenced by all sorts of factors. But one thing that seems to connect a lot of these workers, regardless of background, is this desire for a life less ordinary,
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, a lot of people are drawn to that sense of adventure, the chance to experience different cultures and really feel like they're making a tangible difference.
Totally. It's not just about building a resume. It's about seeking a certain kind of fulfillment that a lot of traditional career paths just don't offer.
Right.
But, it would be way too simplistic to say that everyone at MSF is just there for the adventure. This paper digs into something way deeper, this concept of disinterestedness.
Yeah, this is where it gets really interesting. This is where the paper really challenges some of our assumptions about altruism, especially in a field like humanitarian aid.
So for those of us who haven't spent the morning with a dictionary, disinterestedness essentially means acting for the benefit of others without any thought of personal gain, right?
Exactly.
Pure selflessness.
It's that classic image of the selfless hero, right? Sacrificing everything for the greater good.
Right.
But here's where things get interesting. The paper suggests that even the most seemingly selfless acts are often intertwined with personal fulfillment.
Which makes sense based on what we've seen so far. I mean, even with those incredible learning opportunities and the allure of a less conventional life, a lot of people at MSF are clearly driven by this deep desire to make a real difference in the world.
Yeah, the paper actually makes a really compelling argument that even those who are primarily motivated by moral duty or a desire to serve a cause, they still experience a sense of personal satisfaction, a sense of purpose that comes from making a tangible difference.
So it's not an either situation. It's not like you can only be motivated by pure altruism or personal fulfillment.
Right, it's not one or the other.
These things can coexist and even reinforce each other.
Exactly, it's more like a spectrum.
Yeah.
And it varies from person to person. The paper highlights this through some really powerful examples. Like there's a story of a worker named Modestes. He initially joined MSF because he was drawn to the intensity and the pressure of the work. He even compared it to an action film.
It's funny how we can be drawn to things for reasons we don't necessarily expect. I remember when I first started doing this podcast, I was kind of obsessed with the idea of having all this fancy recording equipment. It wasn't until I really dove into the conversations that I realized how much I loved the learning and the connection.
That's a great analogy.
Yeah.
And in Modest's case, that initial motivation, that desire for adrenaline and urgency, it eventually gave way to something deeper. Being surrounded by all these passionate colleagues and immersing himself in the world of humanitarian work, it sparked this genuine desire to be part of something larger than himself.
It's a great example of how our motivations can evolve over time, often in ways that we don't really anticipate. But it does make you wonder, with all this talk of personal growth and career advancement, is there even space for pure altruism in this line of work? That's the big question, isn't it? And this is where the paper kind of takes a turn that I wasn't really expecting. It introduces this whole idea of indifference as a motivator, which, might seem kind of counterintuitive at first, especially when we're talking about humanitarian aid.
Yeah, it's definitely not the first word that comes to mind.
Yeah.
But the paper isn't using indifference in like a negative way. It's not about apathy or a lack of caring. It's more about highlighting how a certain degree of indifference can actually be a motivating factor for some people working with MSF.
Okay, so we're not talking about aid workers who are just like clocking in and out. What are these different flavors of indifference that we're seeing here?
So the first type the paper talks about is what you might call system-trusting indifference. And this seems to be particularly common among workers from historically marginalized backgrounds. The idea is that these individuals might feel like they don't really have the standing to critique MSF's operations or even like formulate strong opinions about, broader strategic decisions. So instead, they kind of place their trust in the system, the leadership, to make the right calls.
So it's not that they don't care. It's more that they're focused on doing their job within the existing structure. They trust that the higher-ups are looking at the bigger picture.
Exactly. And then there's the second type, which we might call task-focused indifference. This is more about workers who are super committed to the practical tasks at hand, delivering aid effectively, but who don't really express much interest in MSF's broader social or political impact. They see their role as primarily about addressing the immediate suffering, not necessarily engaging in these larger systemic issues.
Interesting. So we've got these two distinct types of indifference, both with their own kind of complexities. I mean, it makes you think about how we often equate passion with effectiveness, but maybe that's not always the case.
Right. And that actually leads to one of the paper's most interesting points, which is that indifference in its purest sense can actually be a way of coping with the overwhelming complexity of the world.
Okay, I'm listening. Tell me more about that.
So think about it. If we constantly dwelled on the, enormity of global suffering, the sheer scale of the challenges facing humanity, it would be totally paralyzing.
Right.
A certain degree of compartmentalization, a narrowing of focus, can actually be essential for effective action.
So sometimes a bit of indifference, whether it's trusting the system or focusing on the task at hand, can actually be what allows us to function, to actually make a difference in the ways that we can.
Exactly. And this kind of brings us back to your earlier question about the possibility of pure altruism. The paper even suggests that true disinterestedness might be impossible to really pin down.
Yeah.
Because the very act of analyzing it, of trying to isolate it, automatically gives it value.
Yeah.
It becomes a thing, becomes like a source of identity or satisfaction, and therefore it's no longer truly disinterested.
Wow, that's a real head scratcher. So what does all this mean for you, the listener? What are we supposed to take away from this deep dive into, the messy, fascinating world of humanitarian motivation?
Well, for me, it's a good reminder that people are complicated. Our motivations are rarely pure or straightforward, and that's okay. It's in those contradictions, those unexpected drivers, that we often find the most, interesting and insightful stories.
Absolutely. And, sometimes those messy, complicated motivations lead to incredible acts of courage, compassion, and service. It really makes you think about all the assumptions we make about people, the labels we apply, and how much richer our understanding of the world becomes when we can kind of embrace that nuance.
Couldn't agree more.
Well, this deep dive has definitely given me a lot to think about. Huge thanks to you for helping us unpack this fascinating paper. And to you, our listener, for joining us on this journey of discovery. We'll leave you with this final thought: what motivates you? And how do those motivations shape the way you engage with the world? Until next time, keep asking questions, keep exploring, and keep diving deep.